Hello, everyone. I'm Glazer of the Snap Justice Podcast, the official podcast of Marvel Snap Zone. Today, we're going to be doing something slightly different. We're still looking at two decks like we always do. We're going to look at two decks from what I would argue are the single two most successful players in all of Marvel Snap. These are the decks that these players are currently using to farm an absurd amount of Infinite Conquest tickets. What we're doing differently, however, today is we're going to look at how these decks started and how they slowly evolved to get to where they are today. If you find that kind of thing interesting, I think this is a really instructive way over how to build the best decks. I also think that it's worth always knowing what the best players are doing. If you want to keep up with that kind of thing, then please subscribe to this video, subscribe to this channel. We do two decks every day. We find you the best decks before the rest of the meta, before the bigger creators have any idea what hit them. All right, ready to go? Take a quick look at this deck. This is Jeff Hoogland, controversial player though he is, original bounce deck. This deck attacked the opponent across two axes. First, it wanted to build up a lot of power by using Angela and Bishop along with Darkhawk. Those cards, in combination with Bast and a Demon, added fundamentally just a ton of power to the board. Darkhawk naturally starts as a 4/6 at the end of the game without any draw effects or any other shenanigans. Black Widow and Korg both tend to add an extra 2 power to that original 6. You can play them multiple times with the bounce effects, Falcon, and at the time, 2/2 Beast. I know it's a 3/4 here. It shows the modern version of the deck, sorry. That would fundamentally make Darkhawk very often a 4/12 or more in this deck. If he starts off with that 3 from Bast, so much the better. Right now, you're at an odd number, so it's 4/11, 4/13. Phenomenal stats for that rate, top of the line, best in game stuff here. You also have a 1/6 Hood. You can play both of those on the last turn of the game for a massive power spike. They'd also be pumping your Bishop and Angela. The other thing this deck did really well is Widow denies draws, Iceman makes it harder to play cards, and Korg puts rocks in the deck. None of those are things your opponent really wants, right? All of these axes combined to make a deck that was extremely powerful. Hoogland created this deck, took it to a major creators tournament, and in the process made it to the finals undefeated. There, he lost to Dara, a player he had beaten earlier in the tournament, but who came back through the losers bracket to knock him out in the finals. However, that doesn't change the fact that this deck was both extremely cool and extremely powerful, and fundamentally, that day spawned a new archetype. That archetype evolved until we get today to this deck, what I believe is the single best version of the bounce archetype. And this deck has evolved so much. The single biggest reason for that evolution, I would argue, is Kitty Pride. Kitty says you don't need as much disruption because you can add an absolutely crazy amount of power to the board. Kitty every turn makes Angela so much bigger. It still works super well with Bast, if you see Bast on one. And Kitty can often represent 8 or 10 power, if not more. You add that to Hit Monkey, who on the last turn of the game, when you're playing, let's say, a last turn of Iceman, Kitty, Hit Monkey, and Mysterio will have 8, 10, 12 power. Then you have a massive power spike. It means the control is no longer as needed. And once you remove at least some of that control, the Darkhawk also goes. Make sense so far? Glad. The deck, as previously built, you can see, had no reach. It had no way to get into certain locations. It was weak to storm. It struggled with that kind of thing. Enter Jeff. This is a direct Lamby innovation. This is the spot in the deck where Falcon usually was, but there's just not as many 1-drops as there were. You'll note especially that Hood is gone, and Hood and that Falcon were an extremely good combo because you never had to really leave that 1/3. Now with this version, the only real way to get rid of that 1/3 is A, play Bast first, which means very specific draw order, or B, get that Beast out to mess it up instead. Jeff takes care of that. It adds an extra dimension to the deck that makes it more powerful, and it's just a really, really good card. Jeff, however, I would argue is the single most changeable card in this deck at this point. The current meta demands Shang-Chi. This is what I'm thinking of as the collector spot in my version of the deck that I had Infinite with. I had Collector here. Eventually, Collector makes the deck because Kitty, Falcon, Beast, and Hood would all trigger that Collector. Well, most of those are gone. So, well, half of those are gone at the very least. So, Shang-Chi enters the picture. You're losing a big power card in Collector. You're gaining a big power card in Shang-Chi. One of the ways that this deck loses is it doesn't see Iron Man and the opponent drops a 20 power Hulk. That can often just beat you. Shang-Chi says, because you very rarely have priority going to the end of the game, I can answer that. I can stop your nonsense and just win the game. Now, the last change is what I call the Darkhawk spot, and that is Iron Man. Iron Man is phenomenal here. Iron Man and Kitty Pryde basically win a location. If Kitty gets to 8 power, you drop Iron Man, that's 16. If Iron Man has been hit by Bast, and hitting Bast, Iron Man hitting Bast is the single best thing you can do as far as the deck goes. Now you're adding 3 to that 8 and Kitty. You're at 22 power from just those 2 cards that can be played on the last turn of the game. At that point, you could have gone off on turn 5 with your Mysterio, Kitty Pryde, and Hitmonkey for an awful lot of power in the last 2 turns. That also does a phenomenal job playing around Wave if you're worried about Wave. You could potentially go even further by using Beast to lower the cost of several of your cards for the replay. That's the main use of Beast in this deck. He's nowhere near as good or important as he was in the past versions where you're trying to re-trigger control effects. The only control effect you're really trying to re-trigger here is Iceman, although you would very often like that Bast back, and Kitty free is absolutely phenomenal. So is Hitmonkey costing 1. Everything else is of medium relevancy here. What this deck is really great at is dropping a lot of power really late and making your opponent go very tall in all 3 locations. You can also just go absurdly tall in 2 locations very often. Your Angela gets up to 8, 10, 12 power. Your Bishop gets up to 9, 10 power. Your Kitty Pryde hits 8. Your Hitmonkey hits 8 or more. Iron Man doubles one of those. Mysterio plays as a 2-9, etc., etc. Now, I hit Infinite with a version of this deck, and when I started playing Lamby's, I was genuinely frustrated. Lamby is, again, like either the first or second best player in the game. We're going to talk about the other person who we could argue for that spot in a minute. My version did not run America, which is just a mistake. I was being greedy because on ladder you can afford to be greedy. The retreats are less costly than in Conquest. So I wasn't running America. That's where I had my Collector, I had my Hood, and I had my Falcon, which is just a way to get greedier with power. That was over America, Jeff, and Shang-Chi. In Conquest mood, again, like those cards added consistency, although I guess lacking America is less consistency. Those cards added this like high power ceiling that I could hit in a certain number of games. But honestly, just seeing the key components of Bast, Kitty Pryde, an early Angela, an early Bishop is so much more powerful than anything I was doing with that other stuff. I started playing this. It was very smooth. I've only used 2 of my like 6 or 7 gold tickets at this point. I used this for one of them. I beat a Wave deck. This does not really struggle with Wave because once you know they have Wave, as long as you haven't made a huge mistake early, you just go off on turn 5 and then play your Iron Man on turn 6 or your Shang-Chi on turn 6, as the case may be. And that tends to work out just well enough that you should be fine. This deck is phenomenal. I strongly urge you to try it out. I know that Wawalos released a version of this last week that was very similar to this. KM Best then tweaked that version further. Lamby, as he often does, said, okay, let's cut out the like cutesy stuff. This is now just power. All right. This is part 1 of why Wave is exiting the Conquest metagame. If you're running a deck that relies entirely on Wave to stop the opponent from going wide last turn, you might need to stop doing that in Conquest. This is reason one. I've been eating wave decks for breakfast with this. They're not easy games, but I'm coming out ahead fairly consistently. Reason number two is the Lockjaw high evolutionary decks care about wave, but not enough. Those wave decks just don't really go tall enough unless they get lucky to stop the Lockjaw decks. The Lockjaw decks just have enough power that they've cheated out something big earlier, so you're not like reliably ahead enough going into the end game to wave. And then the third reason is the decks we're going to talk about next, the Patriot decks. This is the original Gunny Patriot. It became popular for that point in time when Sandman was first buffed to 5 and sort of took over the meta. This deck was a phenomenal counter to the two main pillars of the meta at that point, all the Galactus decks and all the Sandman decks. The Sandman decks chased out Hitmonkey pretty much immediately. Well, this deck could go wide with cheap, powerful things without any real concern. Wasp, Misty, and Shocker are all very obvious cards. They have no ability. They get pumped by Patriot and hopefully Mystique on Patriot. It's nice and simple. Squirrel Girl is a nice way to ensure you go wide, along with for games you don't see or play Ultron, as is Debris. Patriot, Mystique, and Blue Marvel are all obvious. Leech is an amazing Galactus counter. It's also a great way to stop a lot of the go wide decks where their cards sort of rely on their abilities last turn. And if they don't have abilities, you're going to win that game. Hitmonkey, after he's been leeched, is a marvelously bad card. Sometimes you just need to go tall in these decks, and Abomination as a 5'11 or 5'13 does a good job of that, especially because you often have a few other lower powered things in that location. That's the kind of card that can compete almost no matter how tall things get. And lastly, we have Super Scroll. Super Scroll is a mirror breaker. If you have a Super Scroll against the Patriot Mirror, you usually just win. It's so powerful. It's really good at stealing a Cosmo or Invisible Woman, which allows you to play your Mystique and Patriot safely. It's really good at stealing a Sarah for to make all your stuff cheaper going to the last turns of the game. Absolutely fantastic card is Super Scroll in this matchup. This deck took over the meta for a little while. It ended up being extremely, extremely powerful until Sandman's nerf and the release of some other powerful cards pushed it back down. Well, this weekend, the other best player in the game, Moyen, released this deck, which, again, might be the best deck in the game right now. It's at least in the top tier. You can see the clear evolution. This is even more similar than the Hooglin to Lamby connection. This basically says Invisible Woman goes in that Super Scroll spot. It is nice and cheap. It helps protect your Patriot Mystique and protects your Abomination from Shang-Chi. It allows you to make sure your Shang-Chi reveals last. It allows you to drop an Ultron that's protected from Killmonger. Invisible Woman is absolutely stellar in this deck. Shang-Chi is just a must in Conquest mode. If you don't see Abomination, the Hulk is just a problem because it's so big. Those decks that run Lockjaw cards can often cause you trouble because they just drop so many big things that it can be hard to go over the top of them. Shang-Chi doesn't care if they dropped Infinite, Hulk, and America in one spot. It is handled. Still takes the Blue Marvel pump, and you're very likely to have other cards in this deck. The other new card is the recently buffed Dazzler. I was not a Dazzler believer, but this deck just fills the board. Part of that is Ultron basically fills 90% of the board all by himself, but the even without that, the deck does a really, really great job of going wide. It's got a lot of nice early game, and Debris and Wasp really, really help. Your downside here is a 3/6 Dazzler, which isn't the best thing in the world. That's basically Cyclops with one pump, right? But that 3/8 that's so consistent, that's so hard to turn off, that your opponent has to sort of wonder about mathematically, is a phenomenal card. It's an excellent way to win games with Marvel Snap. This is the Moyen Patriot list. All right. Moyen and Lamby are again, I think, in my opinion, they would actually probably agree, the two most competitive players in Marvel Snap. These are the decks that they are using to farm Conquest mode. Are these ladder decks? Yes and no. Some of the cards here, particularly Invisible Woman, particularly America Chavez, lose a little bit of value on ladder. However, these are so powerful. These are some of the strongest things you can do. If you'd like to see some of the other strongest things you can do in Marvel Snap, please make sure you subscribe. We do 2 decks every single weekday. Also, check out our content in Marvel Snap Zone if you'd like to know all the Marvel Snap news. I did a video about that there. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow for another Snap Take. Peace, friends.